In this video, we're going to build a simple dialogue system in Unity. You'll be able to walk up to an NPC, press the interact button and have a dialog box appear with text that types itself out letter by letter. So let's get started. I already have a simple top-down controller that lets me move around the scene. I also have an NPC. It's using the same sprite as the player, just in a different color. And the NPC only has a rigid body 2D and a collider 2D attached. If you want these sprites, they're free on the Unity Asset Store, which I will leave a link to in the description. For the UI, I've created an image called dialog box, which is just a black panel with a little bit of transparency. And inside it, I have a textmeshpro text called dialog, which will display our dialogue. In the bottom right corner, I added another small text object called next prompt. It simply says space and will show it when the player can continue to the next line. For now, I'll disable the next prompt, clear the dialog text, and disable the entire dialog box. Finally, I added a small interact prompt text that says E to talk. This will appear when the player is close enough to talk to the NPC. Select the NPC and add a circle collider 2D. Check is trigger and increase the radius to something bigger. I'm doing 2.5. This creates an interaction area around the NPC. Now create a new script called dialog and attach it to the NPC. Open the script up in your code editor. First, we need a reference to the interaction prompt by doing serialized field private game object called interact prompt. I'm storing this as a game object because I only need to turn it on and off. Also notice the serialized field attribute. It lets us assign the object to the inspector while still keeping the variable private. Next, add two booleans. Private bool called isInteracting, which I'll set to false, and a private bool called canInteract, which I'll also set to false. Now we need to detect when the player enters the trigger. So I'll go into the private void onTriggerEnter2D, which will take in a collider 2D called collision. In here, I'll check if collision.compareTag player and not is interacting. Then we'll set canInteract is true, and when the player leaves, we need to go private void onTriggerExit2D, which will once again take in a collider 2D collision. Where we'll check if collision.compareTag player, then we'll simply set canInteract equals to false. Finally, we need to update the prompt. So in the update method, I'll go interact prompt.setActive, which will take in the canInteract. So if the player is close enough, the prompt appears, and if not, it will disappear. Next, we need to import textmeshpro at the top by doing using tmpro. Then add a serialized field private game object called dialog box, a serialized field private tmp text called dialog text, and a serialized field private game object called next prompt. Now check for input by doing if canInteract and not is interacting and input.getKeyDown keycode.e will call a new method called start dialog. I'm using the old input system here to keep things beginner friendly, but in a larger project I'd recommend using Unity's new input system. Next we'll create the start dialog method, so let's go private void start dialog. And here I'll first say canInteract equals false and is interacting equals true. Then I'll clear the dialog text by doing dialog.text equals the empty string. I'll do next prompt.setActive false and dialog box.setActive true. Next we need to import coroutines by doing using system.collections. Then we need to add a serialized field private string array called dialog lines and a serialized field private float called typespeed, as well as a private integer called line index, which I'll set to 0. Line index will keep track of which line we are currently at. Next we need to create a coroutine by doing private iEnumerator called writeLine, and then we'll start it when the dialog begins. So let's go into start dialog, where I'll first set line index equal to 0, and then we'll call start coroutine writeLine. Now inside of writeLine we'll go for each character C in dialog lines at the index line index, then we'll go dialog text.text plus equals C, and then we'll say yield return new wait for seconds typespeed. This loop goes through each character in the current dialog line, adds it to the text, then waits a short moment and repeats, which creates the classic typing effect. When the line is finished, we'll add next prompt.setActive true. Next we need to have a method to go to the next line, so let's create a private void called nextLine, where I'll first clear the dialog text, then I'll do next prompt.setActive false. I'll increment line index by doing line index plus, and finally we'll once again start the coroutine writeLine. Next up we need to check whether we want to go to the next line by doing if is interacting and next prompt.active in hierarchy and input.getKeyDown keycode.space. And if all these are true, we'll call the next line method. It means that now pressing space will move to the next line once the current line has finished typing. Now go back into Unity. Make sure the dialog script is attached to the NPC, the player has the player tag, all references are assigned in the inspector, and that you've added a few dialog lines. When we press play and walk up to the NPC, you can see that the interaction prompt appears, walk away and it disappears again. Press E when in range and the dialog box opens. After the text finishes typing, we'll press space to continue. Nice! We've now got a fully working dialog system. There's one small problem. If we press space after the last line, Unity throws an index out of range exception. That happens because we try to read a dialog line that doesn't actually exist. Instead of always increasing the index, we need to check whether we are already on the final line. So in the next line method, we'll add if line index is less than dialog lines.length minus 1, so we're not at the final line, and then we'll do the code we already typed. And else false, so we are at the final line, then I'll say dialogbox.setActive false, next prompt.setActive false, and we'll set is interacting to false and can interact to true. So now when the final line is reached, the dialog box closes and the player can interact with the NPC again. So we now have a complete beginner-friendly dialogue system, which is a great foundation for RPGs, adventure games, farming games, or pretty much any game with NPC conversations. In the next video, we could add things like player choices, portraits, sound effects, or dialogue loaded from external files. Leave a comment down below on what you would like to see next. If this video helped you out, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.